Okay, let's unpack this. We're practically drowning in data these days, aren't we?
We really are.
Data about, collective anxiety just skyrocketing, political polarization hitting record highs, civic trust. Well, it's in the basement.
Yeah, historically low.
So the big question is, with all our information, all our institutions, why does it feel like collective suffering and, I guess, psychological distortion are actually getting worse faster than ever?
That exact paradox, that's the heart of what trauma psychologist Ernie Vecchio explores in his work. We're looking particularly at Galileo's unfinished lesson in restoring the heart of a nation.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive, really, is to get into his central argument. There's a kind of missing law, something fundamental we're not seeing, that explains why our civic life and our sort of collective psyche feel so out of whack.
And the claim he makes is, well, it's pretty revolutionary, isn't it?
Yep.
He's saying the core issue isn't just, say, a failure of capitalism or a problem with democracy, though those are symptoms, he'd argue.
Exactly. He calls it a fundamental gravitational mistake, a mistake we've been making collectively since way back in the 17th century during the scientific revolution.
Okay, so take us back. Galileo. How does that connect?
Well, Galileo, as we know, shattered the illusion that the Earth was the center of the universe, the geocentric model. That was huge.
Right. Earth isn't the center. Got it.
But Vecchio's point is humanity didn't finish the job. We intellectually accepted the Earth wasn't the center of the cosmos, but we refused to apply that same revolution internally.
Internally, meaning?
Meaning we kept the individual ego right at the center of our own personal universe, our sense of self, our need for control, for significance. We insisted that was the center everything else should orbit around.
And he gives that a name. Ego-solarism.
Yes, ego-solarism. It's this deep-seated, often unconscious conviction that the ego's needs and perceptions are reality's center. And that, he argues, is the root distortion. It inevitably leads to, well, unnecessary suffering, power struggles, the constant need for control. It fuels the whole machine of collective trauma.
It's powerful when you contrast that idea, ego-solarism, with what the U.S. Constitution was maybe trying to do initially.
How so?
When you think about James Madison, the framers.
Yeah.
They weren't naive. They understood people are, prone to distortion, prone to amplifying their own self-interest.
Right. They weren't banking on pure virtue.
No. They built a system full of checks and balances. It was, in a way, a mechanism designed to manage that very ego-driven distortion, wasn't it? A kind of built-in self-correction.
That's a great way to put it. They essentially built a structure expecting ego-solar tendencies, trying to contain them. Vecchio calls the original design a living scaffold for national maturation. The idea was that citizens and the nation itself would grow into discernment within this structure. It was meant to be dynamic, a feedback loop.
The source material argues that feedback loop broke down. Badly.
It did. It decayed. That living scaffold became, in Vecchio's words, a frozen relic.
A frozen relic.
Yeah, or worse, just a tool used as symbol, as shield, as cudgel by different factions fighting for dominance rather than a framework for collective growth.
And there's hard data showing this decay, this breakdown in this system's function.
Oh, absolutely. The trust numbers are just stark. Think about it. 1964, you had 77% of Americans saying they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time.
77%, okay.
Fast forward to 2024, that number is down to 16%. 16.
Wow. That's not just a dip, that's a collapse.
Vecchio calls it a slow atmospheric leak. A catastrophic shift, really, where as a society we started prioritizing certainty over curiosity, demanding control instead of cultivating discernment, valuing tribal power over participatory balance. It's more than just political disagreement. It's like the whole system lost its bearings. Systemic disorientation.
Okay, which leads us to a really crucial, maybe even shocking point the source makes. He pinpoints a specific moment where this disorientation became sort of locked in, structurally sealed.
Yes, he argues there was a critical historical pivot, a moment that effectively removes psychological discernment from the civic field.
And what was that moment?
It was the adoption of the Goldwater Rule by the American Psychiatric Association back in 1973.
The Goldwater Rule. Okay, refresh our memory on that.
Sure. It came about after the 1964 election. A magazine polled psychiatrists asking if Barry Goldwater, the candidate, was psychologically fit for office. Many responded, offering diagnoses without ever examining him.
Right, and Goldwater sued for libel and won.
Exactly. So the APA established the Goldwater Rule as an ethical guideline. Basically, it said psychiatrists shouldn't offer professional opinions or diagnoses about public figures they haven't personally examined and gotten consent from.
Which, on the surface, seems reasonable, right?
Yeah.
Protects professional integrity, stops psychology being used as a political weapon.
The intent was understandable, certainly, but Vecchio focuses on the unintended consequence. And it was massive. Because this professional self-silencing happened just as media amplification was taking off, television news was dominant, cable news was emerging, the digital age was right around the corner.
So at the very moment the public stage was getting louder, faster, more about performance.
The very professionals trained to recognize psychological distortion, to understand manipulation, narcissism, projection, they stepped back. Ethically bound themselves not to comment publicly on the psychological dynamics playing out in leaders.
Wow. So it effectively granted public figures.
Yeah.
What does he call it?
Psychological immunity.
Immunity?
Yeah. The public's sort of innate capacity, what Vecchio might call the heart's inner knowing, the ability to sense when something is deeply off, when behavior is genuinely unwell, that capacity was effectively discouraged, muted at an institutional level.
And Vecchio's argument is that when you silence that kind of discernment,
pathology migrated from diagnosis to design.
Okay, say more about that. Pathology migrated from diagnosis to design.
It means that behaviors or traits that might previously have been recognized, even intuitively, as signs of instability like extreme narcissism, lack of empathy, constant reality distortion, they stopped being seen as problems to be managed by the system. Instead,
it became strategies.
Exactly. They got reframed, maybe as authenticity or strength or just telling it like it is. The louder and more disruptive the signal, the more easily it could be mistaken for clarity or power, especially without a professional check.
And this, unchecked, allowed what he calls ego-solar governance to really take root, where fulfilling the ego's needs becomes the political strategy.
Precisely. And the systemic inability to recognize and address distortion is, he argues, how the Republic itself starts showing symptoms of, well, national PTSD, chronic stress, fragmentation, a constant state of fight or flight, this pervasive field disorientation.
And that disorientation then fuels the polarization we see everywhere. It hardens it.
Yes. It morphs political disagreement into something much more rigid. He calls it tribal lensing.
Tribal?
Polarization stops being about debating different policies to solve shared problems. It becomes about identity. And that identity becomes rooted in rejecting the other side. Each group defines itself mainly by not being the other group, by constantly pointing out the other's distortions.
It's like looking in a warped mirror and only seeing the other side's flaws.
He calls it mirrored entrapment. Both sides are trapped, reacting to the other's perceived pathology, locked in this dualistic conflict. There is no space for actual dialogue, no possibility of finding shared truth, because the goal isn't understanding, it's just confirming the other side is unacceptable.
Okay, so we've got this deep diagnosis, ego-solarism, and this historical fracture point, the Goldwater Rule's consequence, that basically let the distortion run rampant. But, I mean, how do you possibly fix something like that? It feels overwhelming. The source says the answer isn't in politics as usual.
No, not in political theory. The proposed solution comes from a completely different field. Clinical observation of trauma. It requires a fundamental shift in measurement.
Measurement.
Yes. Vecchio introduces a metric he believes is universal, almost like a law of physics for living systems. He calls it DELAS, or delta suffering.
Delta S. Okay, we definitely need to slow down here. Explain where this came from. How does observing patients in trauma therapy lead to a potential metric for, like, national governance?
Well, over decades in clinical practice, Vecchio noticed a consistent measurable pattern, a kind of curvature, he calls it, in human suffering.
Curvature.
Yes. He observed that when a patient's sense of self, their identity, was primarily centered in the ego, meaning they were driven by denial, by defensiveness, by trying to control everything externally, by proving their significance, their suffering didn't just increase, it increased exponentially. Their whole system, their field, became constricted, compressed.
Okay, so ego-centered equals more suffering, more compression. What about the flip side?
The opposite was also consistently true. When the patient started to reorient themselves, not around the ego, but around what Vecchio terms the heart as compass.
Heart as compass. Yeah. Distinct from just emotion, right?
Yes, very distinct. It's described as a deeper center of perception, of orientation, like an internal gyroscope that knows true north, separate from the ego's demands or emotional storms. When that reorientation happened, the suffering consistently softened, the distortion eased up, the person's system regained coherence.
And he saw this pattern so consistently, he thought it wasn't just psychological, but maybe a fundamental principle.
Exactly. Too consistent to be just individual psychology. He came to see it as revealing a fundamental dynamic relationship that applies to any complex living system, whether it's a person, a family, or even potentially a republic.
So this leads to the coherence equation, the ADS formula. Can you walk us through the main components? We don't need the complex math, just the concepts.
Sure, it's about the relationship between our functional self and our true center. So you have E, which represents the ego. Think of it as our adaptive function, the lens we use to navigate the world, make decisions, get things done. It's necessary.
Okay, E for ego function.
Then you have HC, which stands for the heart as compass. That's the proposed true center of orientation, the source of authentic perception, our internal gyroscope.
Got it. Ego and heart as compass.
And finally, HC, delta S. This represents the change in suffering, or maybe more accurately for a system, the magnitude of signal distortion.
So HCM measures how much noise, how much dysfunction is in the system.
Precisely. And crucially, as you hinted at before, it's not presented as a moral judgment. It's not about good or bad ego. It's designed to be like a thermometer.
A thermometer for distortion.
Yes. HM quantifies the amount of distortion, the degree of incoherence that arises when the ego function, E, tries to usurp the role of the heart as compass, HEC, when the tool tries to become the center. When that misalignment happens, each goes up, often sharply, creating stress, conflict, and breakdown in the system. It offers a potentially neutral, lawful way to measure the impact of ego-solarism.
Okay, that's a huge idea. If colloids can actually measure systemic distortion, what does that mean practically? How could we possibly apply a metric like that to something as messy as politics and governance?
Well, the first step, Vecchio argues, is a conceptual shift. We have to start thinking of the Republic as a living being.
A living being.
Yeah. The Constitution, you could say, is like the skeleton, the basic structure. It provides the rules. But historically, it's lacked the sensory organs. It hasn't had a nervous system capable of truly feeling its own field, sensing its own state of health or distress.
And Fekkius provides the basis for that nervous system, the way to feel the field.
But that's the proposal. It gives us the potential instrument for collective attunement, allowing the Republic, theoretically, to sense its own coherence, its own level of kavyu.
Okay, so let's get concrete. Application number 1 you mentioned, the impact statement. How would that work?
Think of it like the environmental impact statements, the EIS, that are required for big federal projects.
Right, those assess the potential environmental damage.
Exactly. Vecchio proposes that major legislation should come with a JS impact statement. This statement wouldn't look at the economic cost or the environmental effects, but specifically at the likely relational consequences. It would assess the probable psychosocial stress impact of the law.
So lawmakers wouldn't just debate budgets and ideology. They'd have to ask, hang on, is this proposed law likely to increase collective distortion, increase JS, make things more polarized and stressed, or decrease it?
That's the core idea. It shifts the aim of governance. Instead of just imposing one ideology or another, the goal becomes what Vecchio calls curvature engineering.
Curvature engineering, meaning steering the system back towards coherence.
Yes. If a proposed policy is projected to significantly increase dissess to amplify conflict, stress, and fragmentation, then, according to this model, it needs to be reevaluated or redesigned regardless of its ideological appeal. It's about managing the systemic curvature away from suffering and towards functional alignment.
But you couldn't just rely on one-off statements for laws, could you? If we're talking about healing something like national PTSD, you'd need ongoing feedback. Which brings us to the Civic S Index. This sounds like the real centerpiece.
It really is. It's envisioned as a kind of national coherence gauge, something that could potentially track the real-time alignment or misalignment across the entire collective field.
Real-time tracking. How on earth would you measure something like national coherence? What inputs would feed into this index?
It would need to rely on scientifically measurable aggregate data. One major proposed input is tracking aggregated heart rate variability, HRV trends, across populations.
Okay, HRV, heart rate variability. That sounds technical. For someone listening, why is the tiny variation between heartbeats a useful measure of collective stress or coherence?
Well, HRV is a direct physiological measure of your nervous system state. It measures the variation in the time gap between successive heartbeats. Low HRV means your system is rigid, stuck in stress mode, fight, flight, or freeze. High HRV indicates flexibility, resilience, adaptability. Your nervous system is balanced. Vecchio's hypothesis is that if you could aggregate HRV data anonymously across large populations, consistently low or declining national HRV trends would be a powerful physiological indicator of chronic collective stress, fragmentation, basically.
Wow, that's a fascinating and, importantly, a nonpartisan biological input. What else?
Another key input would be language coherence tracking.
Analyzing public language.
Yes, using computational linguistics to monitor in real time the language used in mass media, social media, political speeches, looking for patterns. Are we seeing language associated with fragmentation, with projection, blame, dehumanization? Or are we seeing language reflecting curiosity, shared intent, attempts at connection, systemic thinking?
So the index doesn't care if you're left or right, it cares how you're communicating. It measures the quality of the signal, not the content.
That's the idea. It focuses on the coherence of the communication field itself. High levels of fragmented attacking language would indicate high ADS. More connective language would suggest lower ADS.
So if you have a system, an index, tracking an S, using inputs like HRV and language patterns, then governance can shift. It moves away from just trying to impose control.
And towards curvature stewardship. The Republic, in theory, gets its sensory nervous system back online. It can feel its own state.
And the aim isn't some impossible utopia, right?
Yeah.
Not political perfection.
No, not at all. The goal is simply to restore the system's ability to metabolize distortion, to recognize division and stress as signals and process them rather than just endlessly amplifying them. When the level of distortion becomes visible and measurable, it loses some of its power. It's harder for it to manipulate the whole field unconsciously. Becomes, more like a clinical symptom you can address rather than a winning strategy.
And this connects right back to where we started. The source material points to very real, measurable signs of extreme collective stress right now. This idea of national PTSD isn't just a metaphor.
No, it's presented as a measurable reality. The source cites studies, for instance, showing about 12.5% of American adults reported symptoms consistent with clinical PTSD specifically related to recent elections.
12.5%, that's huge.
It is. And maybe even more telling, separate polls show 77% of Americans citing the future of the nation as a significant source of stress. That's not just normal political worry. Vecchio argues it signals a deep, chronic field disorientation, a system way out of alignment. Hi, us.
So, for you, the listener, grappling with all this, the ultimate takeaway here isn't about finding a new political party or a perfect leader. Vecchio suggests the path forward is about something he calls reclaiming sensory citizenship.
Yes, it's about reawakening our collective ability to feel and discern the state of the system. The Constitution, he implies, was maybe designed assuming we developed this capacity, but we lost it or never fully cultivated it.
The solution starts with realizing the civic field isn't just out there in Washington or on the news. It's also experienced right in here.
Right. Vecchio actually suggests that every single person can potentially feel A's within their own body as a subtle internal signal, maybe a microflinch, she calls it, or a felt sense of compression or tightness when exposed to high levels of distortion or misalignment, whether in a conversation or watching the news.
That leads to the final thought, this sort of somatic invitation.
It does. It's the core of the proposed shift. If you really want to grasp the state of the Republic, maybe the first step isn't more analysis, but more sensing. He suggests a simple act. Just place a finger gently on your own pulse. Feel the rhythm.
You're holding the signal in your hand.
Exactly. You are holding the signal, the presence or absence of coherence right there in your own body. And that micro shift, simply turning attention towards sensing your own state of coherence. Vecchio proposes that is the beginning of the real revolution. That's the starting point for restoring health to the larger system.